January 20th marks 50 years from the assassination of Amilcar López de Costa Cabral, the anti-colonial revolutionary and founder of the Guinea-Bissau Liberation Movement. His assassination on January 20th, 1973, was 8 months prior to the unilateral declaration of independence by that movement, and was 2 months after he had announced in Algiers the formation of a national assembly in the liberated regions of the country, a first step towards declaring the Portuguese colony an independent state the following year. The location of Cabral's November announcement, Algeria, reflected that nation's reputation in the 1960s and 70s as a haven for a multitude of national liberation movements, including groups such as the American Black Panther Organization. As Cabral himself wrote in the late 1960s, "Pick a pen and take note. The Muslims make the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Christians to the Vatican, and the national liberation movements to Algiers." Despite Cabral's assassination, Portuguese Guinea became the independent Republic of Guinea-Bissau. The guerrilla war that he had started and led precipitated a chain of events that would lead to the 1974 Carnation Revolution in Portugal itself, toppling the 40-year-old fascist regime there, paving the way for the rest of Portugal's African colonies to achieve independence. At the time of his assassination, a young African-American activist named Angela Davis, herself having been recently acquitted of murder charges in the attempted escape of George Jackson, spoke about Cabral's legacy.
Listen to the address of Amilcar Cabral, who was then the leader of the liberation movement in Guinea-Bissau. He appealed to the UN for support of their armed struggle in Africa against the Portuguese government. And you may not believe it, but as a result of his appeal, the UN voted not only to recognize Amilcar Cabral's party as the only legitimate representative of the people whom the Portuguese pretend to rule, but they voted their support for armed struggle against the Portuguese. This is a resolution which passed on the floor of the UN. You know who voted against that resolution? France, a former colonialist power. Britain, a former colonialist power. Portugal, South Africa, and one more country. I don't even have to tell you what the name of that country is. A few months ago, Amilcar Cabral was ruthlessly assassinated by agents of Portuguese colonialism because he and his movement were becoming far too dangerous, far too great a threat to Portuguese colonialism and to the imperialist hold over Africa in general. And of course, the death of Cabral was a very serious setback for the national liberation movements. In the first place, for the movement in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, but also for the national liberation movements throughout Africa, in Mozambique, in Angola, in Zimbabwe, and throughout the continent where there continues to be colonialist domination. Yet, those of us who are involved in the global battle against imperialism know that such setbacks are only temporary. They are not permanent defeats because they cannot halt the tide of resistance. The liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau continues to rage on and will ultimately defeat Portuguese colonialism. Like the coup d'etat in Ghana, when Nkrumah was deposed, like the terrible slaughter of the thousands of revolutionaries in Indonesia, the assassination of Cabral can only be a temporary defeat. And I think that any of you who would sit down and seriously study the international scene would see that today the trend of history is very clear. What happened on that day, on December 4th in the United Nations? What happened when the resolution in support of armed struggle against colonialism was passed was a mirror of the forces of history. There is no doubt about the fact that history has already sided with the forces of revolution, the forces of national liberation, the forces of socialism. And through the protests and battles of millions abroad and in this country as well, history has indicted imperialism. History has indicted U.S. imperialism and has already condemned it to its grave. The job of progressives and revolutionaries everywhere is to hasten the death of imperialism.
For more on that, we went to Philadelphia to speak to Professor Anthony Montero of the Saturday Free School. So, Professor Montero, you heard what Angela Davis said a couple of months after Cabral's assassination. Give us a little bit of an update.
Yeah, what she said was completely accurate. However, in 2023, we're looking at Africa at a different point, and so the lives of revolutionaries like Amilcar Cabral have to be thought about and talked about in relationship to the new stage of the African independence movement, which is the struggle against neo-colonialism and foreign military occupation of various countries on the continent, as well as direct war against African countries, as in the case of Libya and Somalia, and not to mention the proxy war, which was recently concluded in Ethiopia, where the U.S. was supporting a rebellion to overthrow that government. But Amilcar Cabral is one of a number of extraordinary freedom fighters in Africa in the period of the late 60s through the 70s. In fact, the 60s through the 70s. These leaders were communist and socialist. This is what is often forgotten or missed in talking about these freedom fighters. The assassinations were horrific and grotesque and began with the brutal assassination of Patrice Lumumba. There was, of course, the assassination of Amilcar, but then in the 70s, finally, the assassination and overthrow of the government of the People's Republic of the Congo, which was then led and who was assassinated by the great Marion Ngouabe. In this sense, therefore, when we think about Amilcar, we have to think about that vision, that imaginary of freedom fighters and leaders who saw the path to African independence in a complete sense as going through socialism and in alignment with the anti-imperialist forces globally, including the Soviet Union. This was huge. Amilcar, ideologically, was a communist. People don't remember or know that he was a member of the Portuguese Communist Party during the time that he studied in Lisbon. Marion Ngouabe, who was assassinated in, I believe, 1977, was also a communist. Modibo Keita, the outstanding leader of the nation, the Republic of Mali, was a socialist and maybe a communist, and clearly Patrice Lumumba was a socialist. So these assassinations were designed to decapitate the liberation movement and deprive it of its most revolutionary and clear-sighted leadership. We are now in a moment where Africa is rising again in alliance with this group of nations of what is called the Global South, from China to India to Saudi Arabia, and of course, including this new reality to which at least half of the nations of Africa have responded in an anti-American way that is supporting Russia in its conflict in the Ukraine against the United States. And they do this very publicly, very vocally, especially at the United Nations General Assembly and at the United Nations Security Council. So in a sense, as they say, what goes around comes around. And now we are back to that moment when Amilcar Cabral was assassinated and this new iteration of African liberation struggles against neocolonialism.
Professor Montero, thank you so much for your time. For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.